Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better. Today's episode is about the book, The Only Good Indians. This 2020 novel by Native American author Stephen Graham Jones mixes literary explorations of Indigenous people's identity with slasher film tropes, making it Graham's first horror novel with mainstream success. Did Jones change something about his writing to get there, or did the literary world catch up to him? We discuss how history, symbols, and context fit into his literary project while asking, why did the white literary establishment like this so much?
You can find show notes on patreon.com/supercontext. Go ahead and leave us a comment there and tell us, did you think that the gore overwhelmed the themes and symbols? Or was it just a good time?
So Chris, to prep for this episode, I went into the archive, which is not an actual archive, it's just the stuff we have on the web. And I re-listened to our After the People Lights Have Gone Off episode, which was my introduction to Stephen Graham Jones, and first time we talked about him with depth on the podcast. And I didn't quite recognize myself. I mean, you said that thing about how, you did not like that book. I was like, I don't remember that, but I had barely contained disdain for you in that episode.
Yeah, I also re-listened to it, and I know memory is a fallible thing, but re-listening to it, what the memories brought up for me were that you really didn't like it, and you were like, "But I'm a professional, and we're gonna get through this conversation."
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but also I was cool with him and
Yeah.
with his work. It was the stories, and I don't
And
know.
let's plant this in space and time for the listeners. So
Oh yeah.
that was in 2019.
Yeah, episode 161.
And I believe it was when we were recording remotely and you were in Atlanta and I was in Portland, Oregon.
It had to be, yeah, because it was June 2019.
Yeah. And we are now recording this in March of 2025, 6 years later.
So we're going to say the month. We're going to reveal some of the production backlog.
I think that's fine.
Yeah. Well, guess what?
What?
I like Stephen Graham Jones now.
Oh, I'm aware. The funny thing is, from my perspective, for the last 4 years, you've been texting me and being like, "Oh my God, there's a new Stephen Graham Jones book out," and I'm like, "I thought you hated horror."
Well, I guess I couldn't handle horror for a while. I think we delved into that a lot over the end of the 2019 set of episodes. And also, gosh, I forget when we did Lovecraft, but yeah, we got into it.
Probably
And
2019. I think
yeah,
that was summer of 2019.
yeah. And we were a horror podcast for a little while.
I think we were like 30% a horror podcast. Yeah.
I can't say with any like psychological certainty what changed. But I
Hmm.
do know that I had read Stephen King as a young man. I'd had a couple horror movies burned into my brain as a young boy. Um, I was not a fainting flower. I was just somehow done with horror, and I wanted nothing to do, especially with the domestic horror kind of revolution, insidious and sinister, and
Anything that involves suburban families.
I mean, but that all kind of happened at once. It feels like to me, and there was that one, I think it was Sinister, where the monster makes the dad kill all the kids.
It's the other way around, but yes,
Oh,
spoilers for Sinister.
makes the kid kill all the dads. Okay.
Yes.
And I
Yeah,
wasn't going to watch that.
spoilers for Sinister and Sinister 2.
Um, but something happened when COVID lockdowns, of course, changed everything. And the book, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, came out. And I remembered us reading the stories. And I felt kind of like, let me give that a shot. Like, let me try that again. Let's give this another go. And it was amazing. It was a powerful read for me. It tore me up, and it scared me, and I felt revulsion and shock, and I was kind of okay with it.
Mm.
And and I think, I mean, who knows? Maybe we can just blame COVID for some kind of transformation. I don't mean the actual illness, but I mean the conditions of the world. Maybe I just got through the the fears and sensitivity that came in when I started having kids, or maybe I just needed it. I don't know.
So it sounds like what you're positing, though, is that something changed with you, not with Stephen Graham Jones, so that it's
Yeah, yeah.
possible you could go back and read those earlier short stories and enjoy
Uh,
them more.
I'm not gonna do short stories. I'm not gonna say one way or the other. But I did go back and I read Mongrels, and
Uh-huh.
um, I think that's the only earlier one that I read. And then I read his My Heart is a Chainsaw,
Hmm.
and I was sold. Yeah, I'm on it. And I would like to go back and read some of his early work that was more like, you know, literary, postmodern, speculative fiction kind of. He's done so much that there's no way to diagnose
Yeah, I
his
think it might be
waves.
impossible to read his whole bibliography at this point. But yeah, so I want to put a stake in that though, like that uh, the novel itself isn't different necessarily. It's you that are different.
Yeah, the only
Okay.
the only thing that I could really point to is that there was nothing like that Solve for X story in The Only Good Indians. And if you're not familiar with those things, let me try to lay that out a little bit. There were a couple short stories in After the People Lights Have Gone Off that were nasties. They were an idea and kind of trying to take it to a place that was transgressive and shocking, and in no way am I saying that that was somehow a problem, but just there was a streak of just awful in that book. And I think After the People Lights Have Gone Off, and I think that that turned me off.
Hmm.
I mean,
It was a
Laird,
little nihilistic for you.
yeah, yeah, Laird Barron was really good for me. Just what, like 5 years before that, because
Yeah.
I read all of his short story collections after True Detective came out. Anyway, this is not a therapy session. Somehow, this book, 2020's The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, got me back into uh, a genre that I had drifted from. And I've read a few more things that you've talked to me about, like Something is Killing the Children. Ooh, right.
Yeah.
And I watched a few movies that I never would have thought that I was going to watch. Like I went to see Longlegs in the theater,
Yeah.
which I liked a lot. And I'm sorry for some people who now think that I'm useless for liking it. It was a very polarizing movie.
Eh. I just saw his new
I
movie this weekend, actually. It was great.
have no idea whether I will go see that or not. Uh, I am not diving into horror. I am not rejecting it after dipping my toe in it. I just kind of got back in there. I've said the title of this book a few times, and I think this is probably a moment when I should say we have kind of a trigger warning or a content warning for this episode. Um, the word Indian is all over the academic literature and the reviews and even this reflective, self reflective nonfiction by Stephen Graham Jones. And I know that's not a universally accepted term. I think it has some, you could compare it to the word queer. That is a slur that was reclaimed and reapplied, but not completely accepted,
Hmm.
as a okay label. But yeah, we're going to be reading the word in quotes referencing ideas that are presented with Indian and Indianness and other variations of the word in it. I am, maybe to my detriment, I am comfortable with using the word when it's a more precise academic term.
Okay. I think it's also important to lay this out, which would be obvious once we get into the quotes, is that that is how Stephen Graham Jones refers to identity, both of the characters in this novel and for himself.
And his own, yeah.
Um, I also want to pivot a little bit and take your experience with the larger book industry experience of this book because we alluded to this, and I don't want our listeners to have to go back and listen to another episode, but in that other episode, we talked about how Stephen Graham Jones is a very prolific author, and he has been writing for, I think, like 30 years now, and has like just dozens of novels and short stories and essays. And like I said, like I think it's probably impossible to hunt them all down at this point. Um, but he did not have success in quotes until this novel, which came out
Yeah.
in 2020.
It would be overstating it to call it a breakout novel because he was read and critiqued academically and was present
Yeah,
in the literary scene in a big way. But there were no NPR reviews of his work before this.
exactly. And I think that's something that's important to me that I want to talk about in this episode. Uh, First of all, in the sense that um, we talked about his work before this book came out and we're interested in it and we're engaging with it. But I never thought like, right, like you said, like NPR or, literary magazines would be like, or definitely not academics
Yeah.
writing articles about him.
Did you
And
not think that Simon and Schuster would come out with a high concept trilogy of his books?
um, no, I really, to be honest, like I don't pay attention to that big industry stuff. I guess what I would say to that is, and I mentioned this in in that old 6-year episode now. He is part of this group of authors that I think of as being the sort of leading uh, horror authors in the field right now, in term both in terms of sales and in terms of creativity. You mentioned one of them, Laird Barron, John Langan, and then Paul Tremblay is also in there. And Paul Tremblay is incredibly popular right now. Like you go to Barnes and Noble, and he's got like an entire shelf of his own of novels. He's and like Jones, he's coming out with a new novel every year, and they are kind of like a group of friends too. Like they do, I don't know, webinars together, stuff like that. But the thing that really stood out to me, this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I was at a different university. One of the faculty at Portland State University announced that she was hosting a webinar where there's going to be an academic conversation about this book. And everybody at the university was invited, and it was also like a nationally broadcast thing that we promoted on social
Holy
media.
cow. Yeah.
And at the time, I remember being like, wow, I can't believe that like they're going to talk about this in that setting. And then I also, I would not say that I'm friendly with him, but in between us promoting his work through our episodes and also just kind of talking on social media about horror like I do, he's a very generous guy and will like repost stuff if he's tagged in it. And when he saw that she was hosting this webinar, I shared it on my personal, I think it might have been Twitter at the time, and he reposted it, encouraged people to attend. And that was really cool of him. But yeah, it still doesn't take away from that. I was like, this is bizarre, right? And that like that there's somebody in this. My two worlds are coming together.
Yeah. That this bloody, vicious book is part of an academic symposium.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to add something else to this, and then I promise you, listeners, we will actually get into the meat of this episode.
Nah,
Um,
nah, I'm gonna drag this out longer.
um, some of you know that prior to my job at Portland State University, I worked for a public radio show. And that public radio show often had literary guests. And one of those guests was Tommy Orange, who I think his book came out in 2017, maybe, there, who was very celebrated as this like um, moment in literary fiction for Indigenous people's voices. And they had him on, and there was a big celebration of that. And when I say like I was on this public radio show, it was an NPR type show. Um, Another guest came on maybe a year or two after that, and her name's Tiffany Midge, and she is at least the book that she was promoting at the time. I don't know about her other work, but like it was like humorous nonfiction, and I got a real kick out of her, both like on stage and behind the scenes off stage. Like I thought she was very amusing, and she just had like a really appealing, sarcastic personality. And one of the things that she talked about when she was on stage is a trend that she sees and that she's commented on in her work. Uh, Two different names that she gives these. One is pretendians, and the other is born againians.
Uh,
And the
that's a little rough. I don't,
I believe what she means by pretendians are white people or maybe other cultures who adopt indigenous culture as if it were their own, so co-opting. And then born againians, the way that she framed it was, I believe it is people who are indigenous, but who were not actively embracing that as their culture and were trying to fit in with white culture, who then, when uh, indigenous culture is popularized, kind of turn around and are like, oh yeah, this is my community, even though
yeah.
they haven't been
Hey,
participating
that's
in
me
it up
too.
until now.
I liked this band before they were big.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and I have to admit, that really struck home for me because I think that if Tiffany Midge met my family, she would refer to my mother as a pretendian and my father as a born againian.
Ooh.
I've talked about it on the show before, but
Mhm.
and he's my stepfather, so I don't have the same blood lineage that he does. But my father is part indigenous, part native, and my mother is the kind of person, growing up, like we would go to reservations so that she could buy jewelry or like interior decorating stuff. The thing that's fascinating to me about my father is around that same time, he had this like, oh yeah, I'm going to celebrate the fact that I have Native American heritage, and went out and just bought like a bunch of, again, like decorations, like nice pottery or art to hang on the wall, stuff like that, dream catchers,
Mm.
but not from the tribe that he's from, just from anyone. Um, and that always struck me as odd. Anyways, Tiffany Midge helped me to understand this. And I think Tiffany Midge is also helping me to understand some of the popularity around the Only Good Indians. And we're going to get into that. I don't want to make that demeaning because I think this is an amazing book and I think it deserves the attention that it got. But I want us to keep that in consideration as we're discussing its success and specifically what the literary industry wanted from it. Because I wonder if those stereotypes come into play there. Was the celebration of this book a kind of performative assuaging of progressive leftist guilt regarding white people's role in oppressing indigenous people?
Well, I always have to cop to the fact that I like learning about cultures that are not my own because I don't have one, especially ethnic identities or racial identities or even national identities. I don't have a base to my cultural heritage beyond middle class America. And so I get excited when I can interact with something that is historically more interesting, historically more not connected, historically more developed,
Hmm.
richer, and then, and this is the really embarrassing part, I really want to have some kind of validation from a member of that group that's like, oh yeah, you know something about it. Good on you.
There it is. That's it right there. Yeah. I think that's a big part of
Yeah.
this.
So I make a point now to just be prejudiced as hell. So everyone knows that I'm not.
Great.
Okay.
You just swing as far to the other
Just,
direction as
yeah, totally
possible.
like I don't
Yeah.
care about your culture at all.
Yeah, we're man, we're hitting on all these buttons here. And I assume that we're offending somebody.
And
But
well, maybe offending, but also what's the point of doing this unless we talk to each other about the shit that's in our heads?
yeah, totally. I do want to say you brought up one other thing for me. So again, like academic setting, at the previous university I was at, I served on a committee that was a committee dedicated to anti-racism
Mm-hmm.
in the marketing of the university, like how we made sure that we are authentically representing our
Ooh,
students,
I
staff, and
bet that got
faculty.
closed down recently, didn't it?
I don't know. I'm not there anymore. But I hope not. I will tell you though that I distinctly remember there was an instance where there was a student representative on that committee, and he was a little aggressive with the rest of us, and I understand why. And one of the things he said was, "I don't understand why white people, when you ask them what their cultural background is, they just say white. They
Yeah.
don't, they're not specific. They don't say what part of the country they come from or what, kind of ethnic culture they come from, right?" And he was absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
Like we default to white or Caucasian rather than being like, well, I'm from New England and I
Yeah.
grew up with everybody drinking clam chowder around me, right? Like that kind of a thing.
Well, let's do it. Where, what's your background, Chris? Real quick.
I grew up in New England. My family, I've done the DNA heritage thing. I am as white as you can get.
Yeah.
I think there's maybe like a 0.5 percentage of me that isn't Caucasian, but I am American, North American, very New England, very Massachusetts. We were talking about before we turned the mics on that I have that New England work ethic that is sometimes a good thing and sometimes a very frustrating thing to live with.
Yeah. You think it's going to get you into heaven, and you don't even believe in heaven.
And speaking of heaven, I specifically come from a very waspy family.
Yeah.
My family is very Protestant, tracing back to the Mayflower. So yes, I have the blood of people who very specifically oppressed indigenous peoples in this country.
Awesome.
Yeah. And it's something like I'm pretty aware of. My family comes from the general Amherst area of Massachusetts, and Jeffrey Amherst, who it's named after, was one of the perpetrators of spreading smallpox through blanket gifts.
Oh, hey, I just figured out why we just say white. I am Virginian by way of Canada from Scotland, with a little bit of Ireland in from the other side, up from Texas. So, ta-da, that's me.
What a religious domination were you raised in?
Episcopalian, Episcopalian.
Okay.
And yeah, that's kind of burnt into me. And middle class, just like, just trying not to be anything that you came from is sort of my background.
Hmm.
And I count my parents as doing that too. They wanted out of their particular surroundings.
So one last question before we dive into the production of this book and really get into taking it apart. Um, what was your family's, I don't know how to phrase this, orientation toward Indigenous people when you were growing up? Like, how were they talked about? How were they engaged with in popular culture? what did your parents tell you about um, the history?
These are all great questions, Chris. I can't answer them well. I'll just say we watched a lot of Clint Eastwood westerns in my house, and we did not discuss Native representation in those because it just went right by us. It seemed
Okay.
okay. And I'm a
Which
little
I
bit,
think is probably like 90% of white people's
yeah, I'm
experience,
sure.
at
And
least in
I'm
our
a little
age group.
embarrassed at that now. So, okay. Who is Stephen Graham Jones? If you have already heard our After the People's Lights Have Gone Off episode, it's a hard phrase for me to say. I don't know why. You have a lot of detail about him. So we're not going to go too deep, but here's a refresher. He was born and raised in Texas, Midland, Texas, and through a series of coincidences and accidents by his own telling, he went from a rural farmer kind of existence, as a kid, to college, got really into it, ended up going to Texas Tech, graduated from there, got a master's from the University of North Texas and a PhD from Florida State, all of which he didn't think he was going to apply to his life. He thought he was just going to keep writing and, he'd be a better writer, but also he would keep being a contract farmer, is something he said, rent a tractor. I think that he might gloss over some of his decisions and desires when it comes to the academy. Uh, he then taught because he had a chance to teach, and he said, "Sure, I'll do that." And he has become a literature professor and writing professor. And now he is in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah, and all of that is in addition to the incredible prolific amount of work that he's generated over the last 30 some odd years. Yeah. Um, something I suspect about him and that I like and I think is amusing, but maybe won't come through in our review of him, is that I think that he is a teller of tall tales, especially
Oh yeah, yeah.
in talking about his history and his approach to writing and things like that. And I think it's on purpose, and it's kind of wry, but you can't pick up on it if you're reading it or listening to somebody like us read his voice third hand. The thing I remember the most from the previous episode we did on him was he had a quote where he talked about setting up knives around his keyboard so
Right.
that when he would write late at night,
And
he wouldn't
forks,
fall asleep
because
because he
his head would
wouldn't
dip.
bang his head into the knives. And I remember at the time taking that literally and being like, "Wow, that's extreme." And then like a couple days after, being like, "Oh, that it was a story that he
Yeah,
told." Yeah,
yeah. I mean, he said that the way that he started teaching was there was a position open, and I thought, I'll do that. And there's a
right.
little more to getting hired in the academy than that. He is a Blackfeet Native American. And I also am starting to learn more about Blackfeet. I think all Blackfeet are Blackfoot, but not all Blackfoot are Blackfeet.
We'll get to that later in
Yeah.
the episode.
And he is firmly and without hesitation a Native American writer, a writer of Indian narratives, as he would say, and writing against the stereotypes and misunderstandings of Native American people.
So then I think we've covered him. We should cover this novel. And this is a great point to put a pin in it and say Super Context isn't a review show. We're not going to walk you through the plot and say what we think about it and what we think is good and what is bad about the book or any of that stuff. We're not giving it stars or grades. Um, but The Only Good Indians is a 2020 novel by Stephen Graham Jones, and it is a horror story about four Blackfeet Indian men who had a incident on a hunting trip in their late teens, and that comes back to haunt them 10 years later and their families.
I have a, a full academic description of the book from Eric Gary Anderson, who's a professor at George Mason University, just down the road from where I grew up. In Demon Theory for Beginners, or The Intertextual Badlands of Stephen Graham Jones, which was published in a book called Post-Indian Aesthetics, Anderson writes, in his stunning 2020 novel, The Only Good Indians, Jones visits horror on four Blackfeet Indian men who did something troubling and wrong 10 years ago, and then, as the 10-year anniversary approaches, find themselves hunted by an undead entity devastated by grief and bent on revenge. Like other Jones novels, The Only Good Indians is intertextual by way of genres. It combines elements of supernatural horror, eco-horror, and slashers, to name but three. That slashers thing, you cannot foreground that enough. He is defined by the slasher movie tradition. I saw an interview with him where he talked about someone convinced him, "Hey, come on out, let's see Scream. It's in the theater." Yeah,
Hmm.
when it was a new movie, and he says in the story, he said a couple times, "No, man, I just want to write. I gotta write." He's like, "No, you got to come see this movie. Come on." It's like, "Okay." And he said he went to see that movie, and then he went back to see it again and again and again and again. This is what he said in the interview, that he watched it like 7 days in a row.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
if you don't know the movie Scream, it is a what, metatextual slasher film
That's
that
exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, it's a slasher film commenting on slasher films.
yeah, and that kind of fits him perfect.
Yeah, I think so. And I think too, like, again, that story gets to like, he just seems like a fun guy. Like, he's got a good sense of humor. He likes what he likes. He's not pretentious about it. I've seen him do both live and recorded talks or be part of panels multiple times. And there's no airs about him.
Yeah.
He's happy to participate in the horror community with other writers. It just
Do,
seems like a cool dude.
do you know how he framed our first podcast about him when he found the link?
No, I don't remember.
He posted it on his website and he said, "Cool, cool, cool." That was it.
I do want to talk about the plot just a hair more, only because we're going to have to get into some details to talk
Well,
about things
yeah,
like
yeah.
representation and identity later. So, audience, this is a firm spoiler warning here. But and Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong because you have read this more recently than I have. But the story is that these four guys kill multiple elk on a plot of land that they're not supposed to be hunting on
That's
because the
right.
elders of their tribe have said this is off limits. And they do it anyway. And this is the part I might mix up in my head. One of the elk that they kill is pregnant. And before they can uh, clean the bodies and actually use the meat, they're caught by a park ranger. So all of it was for nothing in some sense. And who they are haunted by is, I believe it's the spirit of the elk baby, right? Not the elk mother.
No, it's the elk mother.
It is
The
the mother.
the
Okay.
elk head woman who is like and unlike the deer woman or the deer lady, and is both an established entity in folklore, but also particular to the book itself.
Hmm.
It's it's very fuzzy in a good way. They they're caught and they make a promise that they're going to try to make up for this, and they say they will treat at least this one elk the way that you're supposed to. They're going to use all of it and honor the fact that
Yeah.
they killed it, and that goes wrong. They screw that up, and that is the inciting moment of their haunting and hunting.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to kind of put that out there for everyone is that one of the things that is also unique about this book is it does not have a traditional plot structure in that there is one protagonist that it follows from start to finish. There's really three chunks to this book. It's almost like three novellas, really, rather than one novel. And
I would go so far as to say it's three movies.
Sure, yeah. Um, and maybe that's how it'll get made, or maybe it'll be like a mini
Wow.
series with 3 episodes. I would really like to see like a well done version of this.
The way this comes together, it would be perfect for episodic television.
Yeah, and I'm sure, given all the attention this has gotten, that there's some option rights out there. Somebody has grabbed them and is waiting to make it. Um,
Wait, let me guess something. So probably there's someone who can't wait to make it, but they keep getting thrown out of meetings because they say, and we're absolutely not going to change the part where the woman's head gets ripped apart by the motorcycle wheel. And then the person says, well, no.
I don't know if that is necessarily the issue. You're saying that it's too gory.
Not even that the book is too gory, but that someone who's going to make it,
Yeah.
I kind of imagine that they would be really taken by it and really want to put it on screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge these 3 parts because it's a little strange, right? Like we, for the first third, follow one of the 4 men as an adult, and he's killed by the monster. And then the second part is following another one of those men, and he's killed by the monster. The third part is his daughter, and she's haunted by the monster. But this is the slasher part in which she's the final girl and
Yeah.
she defeats the monster not through action but through compassion.
Yeah. You know that I like to read the bad reviews of stuff I love, right?
Yes, I do. I do.
So I looked at a lot of the one-star reviews on Goodreads just to get a feel for why do people not like this book. And one of the main things they don't like about it is, if I may summarize, this makes no sense. Why is this happening? What's with all the basketball? Why do we get introduced to a hero at the end? Who
Yeah.
cares about these guys? And, the jumping around
Hmm.
and the kind of almost not stream of consciousness, but sort of spoken word ish kind of writing. Like a lot of those sentences that Stephen Graham Jones writes are very clear if you read them out loud and
Yeah.
not so clear if you're reading it fast in your head.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit more about like his style later on, but he's I don't know that I'd call him a minimalist, but like I said before just about his personality, there's no frills.
Yeah. I mean, he's not a minimalist because he sort of it reads like a maximalist
Yeah.
text sometimes, but he does not set the scene or introduce something carefully. Like you are usually in it when it's happening. The your
Yeah.
viewpoint is subjective. The imagery is processed through a character's view, maybe even the language. It's very Elmore Leonard. Like the way that the narrator talks is like the character talks most of the time.
Sure, yeah. And I think this segues nice into the next section about sort of the production around this is um, the question of why is this a horror novel? And he has a very specific answer to that. This is a question that I engage with constantly, and both like in duty of super context and also just like in my personal life, people ask me this often, like,
Yeah.
what is it with you and horror? Why?
Why do you consume it and why do you make it?
And he has a really interesting answer to this that I think combines the 2 sides of his sort of writer persona that we're talking about here. He is an academic, and he's steeped in that tradition, but he also fell in love with writing through writers like you mentioned, genre writing, Elmore Leonard. I believe Louis L'Amour was one of his influences,
Yeah, there's
and
a story of a closet filled with old Western novels that his uncle let him read through. Yeah.
yeah. And then we talked about this last time. Joe R. Lansdale is a big influence on him as well. And those are all, like you said, just very like straightforward genre fiction.
Energetic pulp.
Hmm. So he's asked about the why horror thing. I'm sure he's asked about it more than I am.
Every time. Yeah.
Yeah. And he said this. I see fiction as a bread or a cake that's good for you. It's got all these layers, and you process through the layers, digest it, and get nourishment from it. But you give somebody a dry piece of cake, they're not going to eat it. You have to put icing on that cake to get them to cross the room to pick up the plate. Horror, or whatever it might be, the fun part of a work of fiction is that's the icing. That's what gets the reader to that book. And then you can drop them down through all the layers of meaning and critique and commentary and everything you might want to do, or everything you can't help doing, possibly.
What's really cool about that quote is that I assume it's spoken because it's an interview, but that's what his writing is like. Those kind of shifting tenses and a kind of the fun part of a work of fiction is that's the icing.
Hmm.
Like it doesn't quite make sense, but it really pulls you in.
Yeah. And he goes on to say, it's that's it. That's the marriage of pulp or pop with literary leanings. That's what he thinks of as a successful story. And he says, I'm not talking about market success. I'm talking about creating good art. If you don't allow any of the pulp or pop culture stuff into your book, then the audience that's going to engage with it is going to dwindle and dwindle.
You found that quote, and I found another one that is sort of the same thing with a little twist. And I really like this part too. This is from an interview on a film website because they got him to talk about Lost Highway because he said,
Oh, cool.
he's amazed with that, and uh, and also recommended Slavoj Žižek's book on Lost Highway as a book
Nice.
about art that everyone should read. So, I mean, you can go to our Patreon page and see the references that we've got here, and I would definitely suggest that interview.
Mm,
He says, I can tell you a story about me and my dad watching basketball in our living room on a Sunday afternoon, and my dad's brother in law will get drunk and come down the road and kick down our door and get in a fight with my dad. They'll tear up the living room, and it will be a terrible scene. And that's the literary version, I guess. But if I tell you a story where me and my dad are hanging out in the living room watching basketball one Sunday afternoon, and a zombie shambles across the lawn, and he comes in there and starts trying to eat us, then I think, hopefully, that's trying to deliver the same emotions or feelings, but it's wrapping it in a zombie story, which is kind of inherently a good time. That to me, that's Stephen Graham Jones right there. Zombie story. It's a good time. I think genre, he says, is really useful as a device to smuggle across what you want to smuggle across, but do it in a way that's is interesting. And since his sort of core inspirations for this book, like the images all come from his life,
hmm.
and a lot of the connections that people make academically when they're critiquing the book involve sort of historical violence and trauma inflicted on Native Americans. I feel like this book smuggled across a lot wrapped
Hmm.
up in a slasher style haunting story.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think too, something to note, like with all the interviews with him about this book, there's no point I've seen where he goes and connects these dots for you, right? Where he's like,
Yeah.
look at how literary I am by making this allusion here or
Well,
this
he's a
metaphor
professor.
here, right?
He's going to let you make your own interpretation, and he waits till someone in the class says the answer he's waiting for.
Yeah. But when he is asked what, the generic question all interviewers ask authors, where'd you get the idea for this book? He gives three, maybe four different answers. And it's none of them are highfalutin. The first one is me and my wife started renting a house in Gun Barrel, Colorado, outside of Boulder. It's got a really high living room ceiling with a light up there above the fireplace. It's a little spotlight that was flickering once or twice the first week we moved in. We figured that we'd just figure it out later. We changed the bulb. We messed with that light so much. We tried every switch in the house. That light only comes on at the rarest of times. There doesn't seem to be anything that repeats, that makes it come on. So that's probably where this book started for me. Now, if you haven't read the book, you'd be like,
That makes
what the
no sense.
fuck
Yeah.
does that mean? Yeah.
But there's this one bit in the book where seeing a light through a ceiling fan becomes a very important
Yeah.
revelation. So, like, okay, that's an image that stuck in his head, and then that helped him with the book. But he also says either that or, because he's the one saying, I got a bunch of stories. When I was 12 or 13, I went hunting on the reservation with my great uncle Jerry, and we saw something brown, an animal, over on the grassy slope about a quarter mile off. Had a hump, big old thing. It was a cow moose, and we spent 45 minutes or so stalking. Got about 30 yards out from her, and she was in my crosshairs, in my scope, and she stood up onto two legs. She was a bear. She'd been sleeping, a big grizzly. After she stood up, she pulled her cubs over the ridge, over the grass, and I'm just a kid. I'm shaking in my boots. She's in my crosshairs, and everything goes black. My uncle had cupped the scope, and he was guiding my gun down, and he said, "We're not going to do this." And the book is effectively if they had done that, if he had
Right.
not had an elder there to say, whoa, 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 this is not what the hunt is. This is not what we're going to do.
Or the book could have come from this story,
Inspiration three.
which is in 2008, he moved from West Texas to Colorado, and he had elk meat in his freezer from hunting the previous year. And he knew he couldn't transport that much meat to Colorado. So he went door to door in his neighborhood and gave away packages of the wrapped elk meat. And he said he still felt bad about this because he said, when I take my elk, I'd done and what I was always told to do, that we were going to use all of it, all of the parts of the body. But then I didn't know what happened to the meat. And everybody I gave it to up and down my street, maybe they ate it, maybe they didn't. So maybe my promise wasn't good.
Which is also a very clear inspiration for the book, too. Part of
Yeah.
me thinks the light is probably the thing that made him start thinking about the book. And he pulled all these things in from his life, and then he recognized those stories. The light is the kind of thing that seems the most legitimate to me about how authors start off from the stupidest shit, just like a single image that they can't let go of, and then things start to attach to it.
I mean, I think he was probably inspired in that moment and was like, wouldn't it be scary if dot,
Yeah.
dot, dot? And then these other things helped him flesh it out.
Yeah.
But there's yet another story. Um, Turns out he's really into basketball. All those reviews you mentioned who were like,
I know
what's with the
every
basketball?
time one of those reviews was like, "What's with all the basketball? This is a basketball book, not a horror book." I'm like,
Yeah.
everybody's got to relax.
And the short version of this story is that he's super into basketball, but as he got older, he started developing a lot of injuries to the point where he has to swear off from playing basketball. But he wants to engage with basketball, and so he said the means that I do that now is by writing about it in my stories. And it's hilarious to me that people can't have basketball in their horror. It's the don't get your peanut butter in my chocolate routine. The things are any good horror story can incorporate any
Yeah.
other plot point into
And,
it and
and it's
do it
clear.
successfully.
It's clear that basketball is important and that it is felt enough in the novel to actually have some meaning. Now, he called it The Only Good Indians. And as a little segue into our talking about the publisher, I want to say that he mentioned that the original title was Elkhead Woman. And his editor suggested that he change it to The Only Good Indians.
Oh,
And he later talks about how that is a good kind of metaphor or lens to see the book. I mean, we'll get to it, but he says things like, I guess they're all trying to be good Indians in some way. And so
mhm.
he was given a frame or a way to start framing it by his editor and clearly trusted that editor enough to say they had this effect on the book.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about these publishers, which is always interesting for us on Super Context because all publishers are owned by one of five publishers,
All
essentially.
roads lead to Rome,
Yeah,
Chris.
so the book is published by Saga Press in the
No, it's not.
US,
Nope.
but no, Saga Press is part of Gallery Publishing Group. No, that's not the publisher either. Gallery Publishing Group is part of Simon and Schuster.
There we
So,
go.
so it's a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Simon and Schuster created Gallery in 2009 because they wanted to unite editorial teams together. Okay. The initial mission of this imprint, I guess, was to focus on women's fiction, pop culture, and entertainment.
But then Gallery Publishing Group is more than just Gallery. It's Gallery Books, Pocket Books, Scout Press, Gallery 13, and Saga Press.
And so Saga is referred to as their all-inclusive fantasy and science fiction imprint. So there's authors like Charlene Harris, SGJ, Rebecca Rowanhorse, and Ken Liu.
And also, there's a mention here that Saga was part of a different publishing group. It was part of the Simon and Schuster's children's publishing group, and then moved to Gallery. They're reclassifying their genres in imprints within groups.
Yeah, yeah. It's all marketing, dude. It's all, we've talked about this before, my feelings on genre and book publishing, but at the end of the day, it's a Simon and Schuster book. But like, and he even refers to it as a Simon and Schuster book
Yeah.
in the interviews, right? But they, have all their little ways of breaking things up so that the industry knows what genre this is.
Makes it okay that it's genre because it's in an imprint of the
Hmm.
larger publisher.
And it's published by a different publisher in the UK. And this is actually a publisher I'm pretty familiar with, Titan Books. So, Titan Publishing Group is a division of a British entertainment company called Titan Entertainment. It was established as Titan Books in 1981. And they have this is the part that I can't figure out. They have two main areas of publishing: film and television tie-ins and cinema reference books, or graphic novels. And I don't see how this book falls under either of those things.
Well, that's just a failure of imagination, Chris.
It is. It's my fault. Yeah. But speaking of, we were talking earlier about how somebody's probably got the rights to it. I mean, you can see like Titan. That's how I know Titan is. Like they do movie and video game adaptations in comic form.
Now, Jones has something to say about publishers. I liked reading this about him and his take. Let me just read it. As far as building an audience, he says, I think you build an audience faster when you work with the same publisher to market your stuff. Okay, now hold on. Let me get to the end, Chris. I've always helped publishers, and that's been very intentional because the trick with publishing houses is that they always want me to basically publish the same book that I published last season with just the variables changed. And I never want to do that. I always want to write all across the shelf: horror, science fiction, crime, literary, weird stuff. I want to do everything. And publishers never want me to do that. They always say, well, we only do this and we think you can only do this. And so I would always do one book with them and then break it up and go somewhere else. Interestingly, after this book, though, he said the last 2 years, I've settled down to doing mostly horror. And now that I'm with Simon and Schuster, they're cool with that. They want me to do horror.
So you're more caught up than I am, but I think at this point he's done at least three, maybe four more horror novels with Simon and Schuster.
Yeah, Simon and Schuster is putting out his Indian Lake trilogy, which is a wild set of books. They are very much like a remix of different eras and types of slasher films into a kind of history of a slasher kind of lake. I mean, I
Oh,
don't,
like Crystal Lake.
yeah, but then also not. And, I would do it a disservice to try and summarize it.
Hmm.
But the books are My Heart is a Chainsaw, Don't Fear the Reaper, and The Angel of Indian Lake. And it's essentially a final girl trilogy where the final girl never operates the way final girls operate. That is to say, uh, often a slasher film has a woman who is the last victim and she turns the tables on the slasher person or monster.
Yes, I would be remiss if I didn't plug one of my previous works, Charlie. When I was the co-host of Stuff to Blow Your Mind, Robert Lamb and I did an episode on the final girl trope that I'm sure you can find in your podcast catchers or whatever you kids are listening to this shit on now.
What are you doing? What's happening? You asked about Night of the Mannequins at some point. That came out on tour roughly the same time as The Only Good Indians.
Oh, okay. Okay. So there have been four books though.
Nope,
Yeah.
there's one more.
Wow. See, this is like he's a machine.
Let
Yeah.
me look this one up. He slid another one into Saga called I Was a Teenage Slasher, which by virtue of being a fourth book, I think can't be part of the trilogy of the Indian Lake trilogy,
Okay.
but also who knows? He publishes Stephen Graham Jones said, and I'm joking here, but he said, I will never do a Bachman book. I'm just going to publish them all under my own name.
Yeah. So I'm going to cop to something, which is that as much as I love him as a writer, I haven't read any of those recent novels, and I'm way behind. I know I need to catch up. But from what I've read about them and from what you just described, it sounds like the opposite of what he said earlier, that he's not only is he staying in horror as a genre, but he is literally kind of making the same recipe that he made with this book, right? By bringing in his indigenous identity, combining it with his love of slasher tropes, and then flipping the head on the final girl trope.
Yeah, the only good Indians feels like the starting point for the Indian Lake trilogy.
Okay.
And I don't know,
And it's not the same character, right? It's not the
not at
same
all.
girl at the end. Okay.
Although it is kind of, but it's not.
Okay.
And I think it's easy to say that it's not the thing that he said he does,
Hmm.
but it could be anything, right? When he's publishing an extra book, the same year that he's publishing the end of a trilogy that he says he's sticking with Simon and Schuster to do, it's kind of like, did you fool them? Did you just say, "Hey, I've got three books," but also he had two more just waiting to go? Who knows?
Maybe you remember that old Stephen King adage where he talked about that you should always have like two or three books in your chest. I think he referred to it like as backups in case like you get writer's block.
Yeah, your trunk books.
Yes, yeah, that's it. Let us go into what other people said about this now. We're pretty much just talking about our own opinions and then what Jones has said himself. But as we alluded to, there was an NPR review of this. There were actually three NPR pieces on this. I stuck only with this review because the others were more just like, hey, so this book exists and this is the plot and this is the author.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't a lot of depth to it. The review, however, was written by another horror writer. His name's Gabino Iglesias. He is also on the rise as we're recording this, and it's seeing some success in his career. And Iglesias says Jones is a superb storyteller who understands great writing, has to retain the same intimate quality narratives possess when they're told in person. He uses simple language and straightforward prose to craft his dialogue to deliver the action. So that's kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of his style.
But it's also not what some people think. There are some people who say the exact opposite. And I'm talking about non-professional reviewers who are like,
Yeah.
"Hey, I didn't like this book. It's just so hard to read. The sentences are too complex."
It was like my
And
dad when he saw Pulp Fiction and was
oh my
like,
God,
I don't understand why everything was all over the place.
don't do it. Uh, so along with reviewing him well as a writer, this NPR review also brings out this is a Native American narrative and explicitly states The Only Good Indians does a lot in terms of illuminating Native American life from the inside, offering insights into how old traditions and modern living collide in contemporary life. I am not a Jones scholar, so in no way can I say I understand the arc of his writing. But generally, he started with some reflective, impressionistic, more literary explorations of Native American life from the inside. And then he kind of started doing the genre thing and was able to produce a tremendous amount of work in genre.
Yeah, I think what Iglesias is getting at here is something that we're going to touch on later when we look at also like larger sort of academic pieces talking about this book. But the last quote from him here, he says, in this book, Jones pays tribute to Blackfeet culture, speaks about their practices and connection to nature with reverence. But on the other hand, he says flat out that, quote, the three braid days are over and done with, and that Native Americans have nothing in common now with the images that popular culture has perpetuated about them, all of which are cliches, disconnected from reality, and grotesquely reductive.
So it seems like Iglesias essentially says Stephen Graham Jones has brought together two of his writing styles or two of his writing interests and made a blend that does them both well.
Yeah, I think so. And then we get to this other review in the LA Times Review by Rigoberto Gonzalez, who says, an argument could be made that Jones is reclaiming the quote, accursed land or quote, Indian curse trope of American lore that goes back to the 19th century. These white myths portray the settlers as besieged by a furious presence, struggling for dominance against mystical, unreasonably vindictive forces rather than, as was the case, defenseless people.
And he has a little other side of what Iglesias was talking about when it comes to Native American themes. Uh, Gonzalez says if Jones is up to some form of reappropriation, his scheme is overshadowed by the outsized gore, as well as the fact that only Lewis, one of the characters, makes any effort to figure out what any of it means.
So
So,
that's an interesting thing to say and cuts right to the core of what Jones says he's trying to do, actually. The gore overshadows the form of reappropriation. So he's essentially saying that because this book is so gory, that you, the reader, lose sight of the fact that Jones has inserted these themes in there.
yeah, that's the icing. That's
That the icing
the
is
zombie story.
overwhelming the rest of the cake.
I don't know. I mean, I thought that might be overshadowed. Obviously, has a meaning,
Yeah.
but I think he says Gonzalez does. Uh, Hardly a moment for the characters to breathe, much less to ponder what's happening and why. In a lot of ways, he's saying the characters don't do this.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like Jones didn't do it. I disagree with that very strongly. The
Yeah,
fact that the reviewer is saying this means that it was done, right?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and regardless of that was his intention or not, this book got nominated for and won a lot of awards. I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but it won the Stoker Award for Best Novel. It won the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel. I'm unfamiliar with the Alex Award, which it also won. The Goodreads Choice Award. It was nominated for fifth Best Horror
Yeah, but there
Novel.
are all those one-star reviews, so it didn't
Those right,
go.
that's what I was going to say. It's all those guys that you enjoy reading their user-generated content. Then he ironically won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, specifically the Ray Bradbury Prize. So ironic because Gonzalez was writing for the
Yeah.
LA Times.
So the named awards, Bram Stoker, Shirley Jackson, and Ray Bradbury Prize. Like,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's sort of a, hey, here's some people that he definitely is like.
Well, I don't know about that necessarily. My experience, and I can unpack this, most genres, or in some cases like comics, media have award ceremonies that are named after
Oh, absolutely. I'm just saying
literary
it's kind
giants.
of a coincidence that there's, gothic and speculative and spooky all right there.
Yes, and I think that that is maybe the better way to look at those is that um, the Jackson Awards are the more literary of the horror awards.
Don't say it
Um,
like that.
and I think they're great, but that's sort of how they lean. And that the Stoker Award, to be clear, the Stoker Award is voted on by members of the Horror Writers Association. So these are his peers who gave it this best novel.
So it was a well regarded and well rewarded book in the industry and in the literary scene. And I did a quick count. The math is not exact, but The Only Good Indians got half as many awards and nominations as all of his other work to that point.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on this briefly. Um, I love this book, and I love his previous work as well. I do not think that this book is necessarily better than his previous work, but it's worth pointing out that when your publisher is a subsidiary of one of the five biggest publishers in the world, that it's easier for the marketing arm to really push at the people who vote in these
Yeah.
award ceremonies.
And
As a member of the HWA, I know like you get um, arcs from the publishers around award season time. And with a book like this, it's not the author. Stephen Graham Jones isn't sending it to all of us as a
no.
PDF. It's the marketing arm at Simon and Schuster.
And an ARC is an advanced reader's copy. And a lot of times with review copies of books, you also get a talking points memo. I mean, it's not really that, but
Totally.
you
Yeah.
get a description that
A press release.
leans in a press release that leans into certain themes and maybe even has a short interview with the author or book club questions with
Yep.
answers.
Yep.
I mean, we don't have that material to say, yeah, this clearly happened, but I have no doubt in my mind that some of the connections made in those reviews were made in the press release that came with the book or in the notes that came with the book to give the reviewer a starting place for their
I'll go
review.
you one further than this. So we talked about the sort of NPR approach to this, that they all of a sudden that audience fell in love with him. Um, I know from working on this public radio show that it seems like that the people who run those shows must just read everything. And then they, of course, judge what the best thing is. And that's how they decide who to interview or who to review, right? There are entire networks built around these press releases that we're talking about
Yeah.
being put in a place and being sent out to the producers of these shows, the book industry, and essentially saying like, "Hey, you should pay attention to this because this is what's going to be hot in the next 2 or 3 months."
I want to say here, right before we take a break, I love book publicists. I love them all, even the ones that are irritating as shit. I I like them for the fact that they move from publisher to publisher. Half the time I don't know where they are because they were doing this book and this author, but then the next time I hear from them, they're in another imprint in another uh, big publisher. And if you answer one of their emails with, "Oh, this is not for me," they're like, "Thanks so much for answering. I appreciate it. I love a book publicist. If any of them are listening, thank you for all that stuff you did when I was still doing a review show on the radio."
Wow, you are really trying to make sure that you don't get cut off from your advanced reader copies.
It's nice that you think that, but I've already been well cut off. No, this is all historical. This is why I feel totally comfortable saying it now. It doesn't matter. I never
Yeah.
get review copies anymore. But
Really?
when I did, I just loved them. They were the best. The people. Well, Chris, we're still taking breaks, but we have no ads, no sponsors, and we're not going to dig in as deeply as we used to. We're just going to say Patreon.com/supercontext.
Yeah, thank you for listening. If you want to throw us a couple bucks, that would be cool. It helps us keep doing the show, but there's no obligation to. You can feel free to keep listening to a free podcast.
And eventually we'll start doing some extra stuff, right?
Yeah.
You are not convincing me at all, Chris.
Since we've come back from this hiatus, I don't know how much I care about trying to upsell everything.
Seems legit.
We can either keep that or take it out.
And we're back. I should also cop, Chris. I also feel bad about all the copies of books that I got that I didn't review for
Oh
one reason or
man.
another.
Yeah. When I this is going back. For a lot of reasons I'm on multiple uh publicist lists, and I've actually recently started saying to them like, "Hey, you don't send me stuff anymore because I don't review anymore." But
Yeah.
um
Yeah, you got to. You gotta say when you don't do it anymore.
when I wrote for CNN, I used to get physical copies of everything, and I had a closet full of graphic novels that I never got the opportunity to read,
Yeah.
but I did donate them to a library.
Very nice. Let's move into our standard section of representation. And this is an important one for this book because we just said this is a Native American author who proclaims his Native Americanness, who wrote a book about Native American life and Native American history that was also a slasher or a horror novel, and did it in such a way that the publisher foregrounded that stuff and it actually worked as a marketing strategy. It's a good book, but also it worked as a marketing strategy, and people started talking about this is a novel about Native American narratives, about Native American identity. And what's in the book, once we started doing the research on what's really being represented, it got real hairy and really interesting.
Yeah, I also want to throw out a disclaimer here, maybe more so than usual. And I know from comments that we've received in the past that some of our listeners hate when I do this, but it's worth acknowledging that we are two white dudes who are about to try mansplaining Indian culture, Native American culture, specifically Blackfeet culture.
I hear you.
I will be honest, I didn't know any of this shit before researching it for the podcast. So in a way, we're learning this ourselves from the
I
research.
think that's the best way to frame it. Like, this is what we learned. There's no discoveries here except for us as individuals.
So let's start with the title of the book because this is a thing I didn't know that this is actually a proverb. It goes back to the 1860s. The only good Indian dot 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 is a dead Indian. Apparently, someone named General Philip Sheridan was the originator of this phrase.
Well, if you
Uh,
start tracking would it be the etymology of the
that is it.
phrase?
Yeah,
It gets a little loosey goosey. People blame each other for it. Theodore Roosevelt is quoted as saying, "If I imagine the quote that I have heard, then da 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 da."
yeah,
It's some racist shit,
yep.
and it's what ethnic cleansing, genocidal language. That's
hmm
flat out what it is.
We can say that we have this knowledge because an academic named Wolfgang Meeder researched it for the Journal of American Folklore. And in that research, Meeder found that even in present day, the term phrase is still used with surprising frequency, both in literature, but also in everyday speech and the mass media.
This is that casual racism that people talk
Yep,
about, where you feel comfortable, ironically referencing the racist trope because you're not scared of the backlash.
totally.
Yeah. Okay. The Blackfeet Nation is hard to untangle for this white dude's mind. Meaning, there are so many ins and outs and distinctions to tribal nations, tribes, land, names, languages, that as soon as you start listing, well, let me say that again, as soon as I start listing out facts about, say, the Blackfeet Indian Reservation or the Blackfoot Confederacy, I feel like I'm just saying things that could be true. Like I don't, I'm like reading Shakespeare as a fifth grader. Like I
Well,
don't know what I'm saying.
let me unpack why I put this in the notes then. Full transparency. So I think there are some things about the history of this tribe that are worth us understanding to get perspective on what Jones was doing with the themes
Absolutely.
in the book.
I just don't feel like I can say, here are some true things. All I can say is,
Sure.
here is stuff that helps me understand better something I don't really have knowledge of.
Yeah, and we don't have to do all of this, but there's, I think, a few things that are pertinent. The first is, again, I did not know physically where the Blackfeet Nation exists. They are one of the 10 largest tribes in the United States, and I didn't know that. And I am an almost 50-year-old adult human being who was raised in this country.
Well,
So
you
that
had a lot of Marvel movies to watch, dude.
is true. Yeah, I needed to find out more about Thanos. Um, but there was a treaty in 1855 that basically established that the reservation for the Blackfeet Indian tribe would be located in northwest Montana. They actually settled that region probably around the 17th century. And surprise, surprise, around the 19th century, their territory was encroached upon by European Americans and Canadians. And they were forced to cede their lands and ultimately move to smaller reservations and reserves than what they originally held.
All Blackfeet are Blackfoot, but not all Blackfoot are Blackfeet. That's a quote. The Blackfeet Reservation is in northwestern Montana, right up to Canada, right up to Glacier National Park. It is still the 13th largest reservation in the United States, 1.5 million acres.
Wow.
The name Blackfeet could be one or two things. It could be the French seeing that the Indians had feet that were black because of ash that they walked through for some reason, or it could be a reference to buffalo hooves, or it could be none of that, and we just don't have a sense of why.
I think, again, for the book, like another important historical moment is to note that after the collapse of what this entry refers to as buffalo culture, the Blackfeet tribe settled for $1.5 million and retained the right to, quote, go upon the land and hunt and fish and harvest sacred plants and wood from what is now Glacier National Park, which was traditionally their land. Um, that's important because the story of this book is literally like four people go and hunt in a place that they're not allowed to hunt in.
Yeah. And there is an event that is connected to the book's narrative by an academic, I believe Polish academic named Carlos Kaj, Tkacz, who talks about the Marias massacre, which is I'm just going to read the description. A pivotal, defining moment in the history and literature of the Blackfeet Nation. The Marias Massacre took place on January 23rd, 1870, when, as described by Roger C. Henderson, the U.S. 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Major Eugene Baker, decimated Heavy Runner's camp without warning in an illegal and unprovoked ambush. No depredation had been committed by the band, and Heavy Runner, this is the leader or a leader, and Heavy Runner carried papers identifying him as being on peaceful terms with the United States. And yet, Major Eugene Baker tore up the paper, killed 217 non combatants, and then destroyed the entire camp. Uh, this is one of those moments that live in infamy, but only infamy if you know about it. And not a lot of people know about it. This is the Tulsa massacre that suddenly
Sure.
became popular knowledge when it was on a TV show.
Hmm.
The comparison, the connection that this academic article, Not the End of the Trail, Violence, MMIW, and Environment in Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians, the comparison is that the way that our characters in The Only Good Indians shoot up a whole bunch of elk, that they are, one, not authorized to do so at a time that they shouldn't be doing it, and for no good reason, is an echo of the Marias Massacre.
Mm. Um, I think that is probably a good segue then for us to get into the elk symbology here too, which is again like a thing that I was not familiar with. Um, Native, not all Native American tribes, but multiple Native American tribes hold the elk in high esteem and consider the elk to be a relative who brings strength, endurance, and patience. So there is a cultural affinity for the elk as an animal, which is part of the importance of it in this book, but also part of the importance of the elk. What do they call her? The elk-headed woman,
The elk-head woman, yeah.
to as being the big bad, the villain of the piece.
And you
That they
remember,
have betrayed her.
yeah, and you remember we talked about Jones saying the thing about elk. He hunts elk, and he said he did what he always does when he shoots an elk. He promises to treat it with respect and use all of it.
Yeah.
Here's another quote from Jones about elk. I think the reason elk matter to me is whenever I take an elk or I'm part of a hunting party that takes an elk, I feel like there's an ethical obligation to that animal to treat it with respect. And I feel that to every animal that I might take out in the field, of course, but generally we're out after elk. So if I were a rabbit hunter, maybe this would be a novel about rabbits, but I mostly go after elk. So this turned out to be an elk novel.
Again, like totally disacknowledging that there's like a historical precedent and symbology involved here. He's just like, well, that's just what I hunt. Um, he cracks me up sometimes. I think it's worth noting here too, like another sort of pop culture point of reference in the last couple of years. Right around the same time that this book came out, Reservation Dogs started as a television show. And if you have not seen that, it's about four kids growing up on a reservation in Oklahoma. Uh, or actually, I don't even know if they're on a reservation. They're just in a community. But the deer lady is a sort of haunting horror mythological figure in their story.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit. Not not a thread that is
Like
somehow
once
the
a
whole show,
season,
but
there's an
yeah.
episode that she shows up in. Yeah.
We should talk about reservation dogs. That should be an episode.
Well, you've already said that to me offline, and I think what I would say is sure, and I really love that show, and I know you do too. But also, in the same way that we're acknowledging that this book is kind of fetishized by white people, I think Reservation Dogs is fetishized by white people.
I'm sure it is. But also, I loved it as a television show, and I'd like to talk about things I really like.
Well, one of the things that I want to talk about is Stephen Graham Jones and how he thinks of identity, specifically his identity in relation to these characters in these books. Um, and he kind of touches on what I was talking about just now. He says, in the marketplace or the critical establishment, they want American Indian fiction or literature to stay close to what's considered the main trunk of literature, where we don't go out on the branches and play in things like science fiction and fantasy and horror. But I think it's really important for us to run out on all those skinny branches and claim whatever we want, you know? I want to interrogate what it means to even be a good Indian in 2020. Does it mean subscribing to the old ways? Does it mean adopting other ways? How do you navigate the world when success in one area is failure in another? And it turns out there's not a single way to be a good Indian. There are maybe 7 million ways to be a good Indian. I want to point out too, like we read multiple interviews with him for the research in this episode, and that 7 million ways to be a good Indian is in all of them. That's
Yeah,
like
that's a phrase that he locked into for himself.
yeah,
Um, he represents his own Indianness, as he says, but also people want to talk about him as a Native American who represents Native American literature and ideas. Entertainment Weekly had a headline: "Could Stephen Graham Jones be the Jordan Peele of horror literature?" Which is uh, I think you said it best. Ugh.
that's what I wrote in the notes.
What kind of
It's just
comparisons are we making here?
it's so
Why are we making them?
reductive. Yeah, and like at the same time, this is exactly what I mean, right? Like at the same time that this like massive pop culture magazine is like, "Hey, let's celebrate this traditionally uncelebrated culture and how it's weaving its way into genre fiction." But the only way that we know how to do that is by comparing it to the one other guy who has done that recently.
Stephen Graham Jones says that he tries to write with assumed Indianness in the sense that his characters are Indian unless he tells you differently. And that's how it should be. And I don't mean that that's like a hard and fast rule, but he just wants it to not be exotic.
Yeah. And again, plot point here. Uh, so in this novel, most of the main characters are indigenous, except for a character named Peta, who is, I think she's the wife of one of the hunters.
Yeah.
Um, and that is important because it is a part of that character's arc in that, like, he is struggling with the fact that he married a white woman and all of the implications that brings with it, both from the outside world and from his own community.
And he says that he wants every character in the book to interrogate what it means to be a good Indian and to make it clear there's not a single way, that there's many ways. He says, I think whatever way gives you happiness or satisfaction is what it means to be a good Indian. You don't have to adhere to traditional ways. You don't have to adopt new ways. You don't have to walk this line or that line. You just be happy, and that's the way you be a good Indian, I think. Like, he is certainly declaring that he is dealing with his identity and what he is representing in the novel, but he's also trying to free it. He's trying to
Yeah.
uh, undo a lot of requirements. Like he's against the whole blood quantum test for.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really? He said that?
Yeah, and I say against, like he said that's not. I don't think that's important. Yeah, just
Hmm.
kind of brushed it aside in an interview.
Um, so there was one particularly interesting spot where he was interviewed. It's a literary, I guess, journal called Res Gothic. And in the interview, the interviewer asks him, "What do you think about that phrase, Res Gothic, which is the industry's phrase for Native American fiction?" I didn't even know that's what they were terming it. He asks, "Is that a good buzzword for what you do?" And Jones
Buzzword
says,
giving away the whole game.
Totally." But Jones has again, like this is, I read his response in kind of a wry, like tongue-in-cheek voice, but he says, "I didn't even know that was a term until somebody forwarded me a screen capture from Instagram." Number one, it's a catchy term. That's the first requirement. So I think it's descriptive in a good way. The marketplace and the corporate establishment want American Indian fiction to talk about identity politics, issues of representation, and history and tragedy and everything. They want it to be literary, and they want it to always be somewhat autobiographical. But that is really casting us as extras in a John Wayne movie. We are not those kind of Indians anymore. And I think we can run out and do horror and science fiction organically.
this is his cause, or one of them. He wrote an article or an essay called "Letters to a Just Starting Out Indian Writer and Maybe Myself," and he lays a lot of this out. He's very clear. Don't write the Native American trope that puts you in touch with the land and somewhat ethereal. Don't be an elf, he says.
Yeah.
And he says part of how you can do that is write genre fiction.
The way he phrased that is sometimes the way not to be an elf is to write about elves.
Which is pretty good. I mean, he says, uh, track your blood all across the shelves, right? Write in all of them and leave your mark. But he's not. So he is engaging with Native American identity and representation, and he has a thesis or theories about it that he's using to inform the work. And he's also putting the icing of genre on top of it.
Hmm.
But he's also not letting the genre just sit there and be alone. He's also interrogating his genre and his genre delights.
Ah, okay. So what you mean here is slasher movies and Final Girls.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he talks a lot about the final girl thing, and so one of the things I think that is funny about this is, it depends on the medium in which he's being interviewed for, right? But if it's like NPR and he's like talking to Terry Gross and
Probably puts
dropping
on the
Final
professor
Girl,
voice. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know necessarily that she's going to know what he's talking about. I wonder how many of the Friday the 13th Terry Gross has seen. That would be an interesting question for her.
Oh, we should email her.
Yeah, I'm sure she'll answer. But he talks in several of the interviews about the final girl trope and his interest in it and what he was trying to do in this book specifically. And he said, I wondered what would happen if you took a slasher and it butted heads with final girls, but they were living on a reservation. I think girls who come up on the reservation probably come up tough, pretty tough, I thought maybe she, this is the female protagonist at the end of the novel, would have the skill set that she needed to dispatch a slasher. Usually it's some kind of unrealistic thing when somebody puts a regular person against Jason or Michael or Freddy or whatever. But then, as it turned out, trying to play with my action figures and pit those two against each other, it turns out that for a long time, I've been dissatisfied with the slasher. The final girl in the slasher, in order to win the day, usually it comes down to a game of who can take the most damage and give back the most damage. So it becomes a game of muscles and toughness. To me, that always feels like the final girl is having to cash in on her characteristics, the things that have gotten her along in life so far. I found myself wondering with the Only Good Indians, what would happen if the final girl won the day? Not by swinging the machete the hardest or finding a chainsaw or whatever, but what if she won with compassion, which is what she's had her whole life?
And in there is the slasher fan who doesn't fall into, oh, did you see how he killed that person? Like he says he loves slashers, but he's also talking about how the slasher is not the most important part. But
Uh-huh.
that's fun for a story that's powerful. And then he's digging into what does it mean to be a character positioned in a slasher movie where you have to become the slasher. You become
Mm.
violent. You become dangerous. You become inhuman in some way.
I'm
And
pretty sure I know the answer to this, but have you seen the movie You're Next?
I sure have.
Oh, you have? Okay,
This is
great.
part of the whole the renaissance of horror for Charlie.
So I feel like here, without naming that film, he's commenting on that film because and no spoilers, but the hook of that movie is that it's a slasher movie where the final girl turns out to be like a total survivalist badass that nobody expected to actually have those skills. And so she spends the rest of the movie just decimating the killers.
And they are amateur enough that she can take them.
Yeah, and it one, it's funny, right? But two, it's also like a maybe not wish fulfillment, but it's different from most final girl tropes in that usually those characters Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street is not like a tough knuckle broad from the streets who's going to fist fight with Freddy at the end, right?
Yeah, the argument is almost this person's been traumatized so much that their niceties or their false face of politeness in civilized society is torn away, and now they can engage the slasher on their own terms
Yeah.
and slash back. He said, the slasher is a wonderful thing to believe in, really. It's wish fulfillment. The spirit of vengeance rising to punish the guilty that presupposes a world in which evil is punished, which is to say, it presupposes a fair world. And that's not the world we live in. But I really like to engage slashers because they let me believe in that world for just a little bit. And yeah, so the thing about that is the spirit of vengeance is often the slasher who punishes the guilty until
Yeah.
suddenly they become the guilty, and then vengeance rises out of a final victim who is usually a woman and is the final girl. It's like he's describing the slasher tenets both as someone who enjoys them, someone who thinks that maybe they're wrong, and someone who wants to play with them in his own work.
Yeah. Um, so you know, that's the end of our section on representation. I'm sure there is both a lot that we missed and a lot that we got wrong, but this is has been educational for me.
Yeah. And something that clicked for me reading about Native American literature and critiques of Native American literature and, you know, expositions on Native American literature that connected to the slasher stuff that Jones talks about is this idea of regenerative violence, especially regenerative violence narratives in the American Gothic. Were you familiar with this before I started throwing them into the notes?
No, I wasn't, but the minute I started reading these notes, I was like, "Oh, this ties up
It totally
what
made
I
sense.
brought up
Yeah.
at the beginning, my concerns about white people, what I just referred to earlier as fetishizing indigenous pop culture."
So there's an article called Bleeding All Over the Shelves and Tracking It Out into the World, Theorizing Horror in the Indigenous North American Novels, The Only Good Indians, and Empire of Wild. Okay,
Wow,
that's a
that
lot.
that is such an academic title.
And the article posits regenerative violence narratives in the American Gothic, which is kind of like saying, you know, American literature in the 17 and 1800s.
Hmm.
That those narratives of regenerative violence, which I will explain in a second as well as I can, become retroactive justification for eradicating indigenous people, which means that American literature, in a way, was an attempt to soothe the guilty heart of America after the genocidal push of the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
Yeah.
And the only good Indians, the book, in a way, blows up a regenerative violence narrative by taking the white people out of it and undoing its cyclical nature. Okay, here's some quotes from the article to try and get across what I think I got right in the thesis. Regenerative violence was first theorized by Richard Slotkin, a scholar of the Western genre. Regenerative violence is a cyclical process that erases white guilt through various forms of violence, whether metaphorical or literal, in which means that the white settlers, say, or the white colonials, are hurt in some way by the Native American other, the Indian other, and thus become violent and more like the land and the inhabitants of the land who've hurt them, slaughter all the people that hurt them, and thus claim the land as theirs because now they're both white and like the natives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that sound like at least enough for us to get through this section?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Let's move on into because specifically the case study here is this book.
Yeah. So, from the point of view of the four men in The Only Good Indians, the Elk Massacre was a grand event, the Thanksgiving Classic. This is what they call it, right?
The characters call it the
Yeah.
Thanksgiving Classic.
This name is an ironic reclamation of Thanksgiving, American holiday for which the four men, the characters in The Only Good Indians, have no love. Thanksgiving is a day marked for many indigenous North Americans by remembrance of the intense physical violence perpetrated against indigenous peoples during massacres like the one at Marias. Holiday is a continuation of that violence, silencing counter narratives through the portrayals of vanished Indians that the holiday perpetuates, i.e., it kind of uh, neutralizes all the Indians as welcoming, oh, yes, let's have a Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And then uh, the reader, this is still the article, the reader is forced to ask why Jones would position these Blackfeet characters as people who would commit a colonialist like massacre given their tribe's history. The answer that presents itself throughout the novel is that their lifelong attempts to be good Indians led to the violation.
Mm-hmm.
While the four men were trying to resist Indianness, meaning they were trying to be good Indians by not being like an Indian, but being like an American, like a white person wants an Indian to be, or some version of that. The fact that they accepted a monolithic fantasy of Indianness made it impossible for them to do so, impossible for them to resist this, these stereotypes, this trope. They became as violent as the colonizers who created the racist representations of the Indianness that they attempted to resist. And then the Elkhead woman haunts them for that. And through
Yeah.
that, she takes advantage of how each man tries to be a good Indian. But that's also not her point. Her point is revenge and vengeance. So she's also violent, kind of doing the exact same thing, inflicting violence that's been inflicted upon her. And Jones sets all that up. And then his final girl twist is him saying, we're not going to do the violence back to the slasher, back to the
Yeah.
monster, to end them and reclaim ourselves with the slasher sort of embodied and absorbed. Instead, there's going to be some forgiveness and spoiler alert, but also none of the details are clear in what we're describing. So I think you can still
Yeah.
enjoy the book. Instead of becoming a final character who can fight the monster like the monster fights them, instead, and from the article, she makes a relationship with the monster that haunts her instead of blindly killing it. The monster and what it represents isn't going anywhere, not due to the violence of denial that regenerates the racism inherent to horror. By metatextually making racial authenticity itself the core of horror in Good Indians, Jones delivers on the expectations inherent in the horror genre while injecting an anti-racist transmotion, that's a term for the article, that disrupts notions of racial authenticity and white North American subjectivity with an indigenous North American subjectivity. All that to
Dude,
say,
dude, I gotta tell you, like, I'm into this, but this writing is so academic. It's difficult to follow.
yeah, totally. So all that to say that Jones delivers a story that makes sense through tropes,
Yeah.
but inverts those tropes and places Native Americans and monsters and white people in different places than those tropes normally place them, i.e., white people are absent, the Native Americans are aggressors and saviors, and the monster is the victim and the
Hmm.
aggressor simultaneously.
So I think a good place for us to wrap this up is with one of the articles that you previously referenced, which is by a person whose name neither of us can pronounce, Carlos Chikaj.
Kaj?
Chaj. Uh, Carlos talks about specifically another like genre term, native slipstream. So we've got res gothic and now we have native slipstream. But they describe this as a narrative technique that they'll discuss later. They don't even unpack it. That's funny.
Let's peel that apart, dude. Let's start again. Okay. The novel through narrative slipstream, which is a way to do what it's about to describe,
Yeah.
engages with how the past, present, and future are intertwined and mobilizes the slasher genre to address some of the more urgent issues concerning Native Americans today, namely the violence of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the looming environmental crisis.
Yeah,
So,
this I think is a really important point to hit home that we haven't talked about yet. And it is again like another thing that I think most white people don't understand about Indigenous history and culture and feelings about living in modern day America. It's really only something that I began to understand when I was living in the Pacific Northwest because it's more common there, unfortunately.
yeah, because there's more proximity to established reservations, right?
Yeah, that and that for whatever reason, this is another episode, but the Pacific Northwest is also a great hunting ground for serial killers, apparently.
Oh, yeah, of
There's like
course.
a
Yeah.
higher percentage, that might be an urban myth, but there's a lot of these kind of murders.
And that's the label that, the Pacific Northwest is serial killer territory. True or
Hmm.
not, that's the feeling. And yeah, I imagine native slipstream to be a kind of presence of the past in the present that is then written with that dual understanding of a moment where you get, a Native American character talking about the elders and the ancestors and, the the elk being a sacred being while also talking about how that's not so important to them now,
Hmm.
that they're not going to be beholden to the thing that lives with them all the time.
I think another way to think about this, or at least I'm thinking about it, is that we've talked about how Jones sees his project, maybe sees his own identity as that, like, in order to be a quote, good Indian, you don't necessarily have to adhere to old traditions or be trying to make new ones, right? Or trying to modernize. The thing that makes this book work is that his characters are like him. They have that same kind of approach to their identity. Their identity is just surviving, just being the people they are. It's not hundreds of years in the past, and it's not trying to catch up to the present.
Yeah, it's being in the present, right? Just by being around, he says, you can be a good one.
You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
All show notes are available at patreon.com/supercontext.
And you can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com.
I'm available on Blue Sky as @Christian Sager.
And I am not available. I have a scorched earth policy on social media. 2 N's, 2 T's.